Hi, welcome everyone to this new session of the fourth edition of the Virtual Island Summit Day 3. I'm Audrey, Director of Operation and Growth at Island Innovation. I'm from and based the island of Guadeloupe in the Caribbean. Today we will talk about education with our dear friends, the Edge Foundation. Researching island education, what are those lessons for the future? But before we jump into the topic, we would love to know where you all are from and what you do. You will see appear on your window, as you can see now on your screen, that will give you the opportunity to tell you where you come from, your sector in your industry. But in the last two summits, the Edge Foundation has hosted sessions showcasing some of the amazing education practices on islands around the world. This year, we will look at islands as a leading educational research hubs, trying and continuing to evolve new approaches that have application in islands, but also in mainland context. And speaking of islands and the mainland context, feel free to tell us also where you're from on the chat, to present yourself, tell us where you're from. I see people from Trinidad, from the Philippines. This is amazing. And then soon we'll have the opportunity to look at the results of the poll. And then I see Jamaica. Hi, Jamaica, Cayman. Very happy to have you see so much diversity and present from the different places of the world. So we see we have some Caribbean people, North America, Europe, a bit of Asia, Pacific, Africa. Lots from the academia. Great, you are the right place. From the private sector. Amazing. I see someone from Sweden. Nice. Alaska. Amazing. This is amazing to see. I will leave the voice now to Ollie Newton, the Executive Director of the Edge Foundation, to lead this amazing session. And thank you again for them to be there with us for the third time this year.
Thank you so much for that lovely welcome, Audrey. And it's lovely to be back with you. Congratulations to the Island Innovation team for such a great summit already. I really enjoyed joining you on Monday to kick things off. It's our third year here, as Audrey says, and we're really happy to be here. The Edge Foundation is a UK-based education charity. We work all over the world, though, and we have a particular interest in islands, both around the UK and internationally. We, in the past couple of years, as Audrey said, and you can now get the videos on the great website, looked at some examples in practice where schools, colleges, and others have been engaging in some unique practices in education on islands. And this year, as Audrey mentioned, we're going to shift the focus slightly and talk about the really important work that islands are doing as innovators, but also as research test beds and an opportunity to understand practice that might be shared to other islands, but might also have some really important impacts on the mainland's countries as well. So I've got a collection of really amazing panelists for you, and I'm looking forward to introducing them to you. What we're going to do is have four presentations. We'll have a little bit of time for me to ask a few questions in between. And then at the end, I'll be bringing in questions from the audience and discussion. So feel free to be chatting away to each other and to me in the chat. I'll keep an eye on that. And if you've got kind of quick questions for us in there or responses, that would be great. But if you use the Q&A function at the bottom for any questions you'd like me to ask the panel when we come to the end, that would be absolutely fantastic. So without further ado, I'm going to bring in our first two panelists, and I'm particularly proud to kick off with them. So Dana Debus and Catherine Ems are our two senior education and policy researchers here at the Edge Foundation. And Kat and Dana have just launched today, perfect timing, a report looking at the way that responses have happened to COVID-19, a really big issue that I know has been kind of a challenge across the last couple of conferences in particular, and in particular looking at the experiences of vocational learning and teaching from colleges in the British Isles. So Dana, Kat, over to you.
Thank you, Ollie. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us at this session today. So as Ollie said, my name is Dana Debus, and both me and my colleague, Kat Ems, are senior researchers at the Edge Foundation. And we're really happy to be presenting this piece with you on vocational learning and teaching during the pandemic. experiences from colleges on the British Isles. We've been working on this project for almost 2 years now, and the report has been published today online. So it's very fitting for us to be discussing the research with you. And Kat and I worked very closely together on this, so we really wanted to kind of put in a team effort and talk about it. So you can find the full report on our website, and we'll share a link in the chat as well. Just the next slide, Kat. So just a bit of background about this research. So it was developed to understand how further education colleges on small British Isles experienced online learning during COVID-19, specifically how vocational courses in colleges were adapted online. We wanted to hear reflections from small islands and colleges on the small islands on how online learning will impact delivery for the future, and of course lessons learned during that process. So the main questions that the research we developed around this piece were, the research questions were how the British Island College provision of vocational education and training courses have been adapted online during the COVID-19 crisis. What have been the benefits and drawbacks of online learning? How will future provision at colleges change based on lessons learned during the crisis? So we used a qualitative methodology where we reached out to 4 further education colleges on islands. We looked at course provision at level 2 and level 3 in vocational education and training, and that often was the cohort of 16 to 18 age group. We interviewed senior leadership team at the colleges, teaching staff, students, support staff, and digital coordinators, and interviewed a total of 31 participants. And these interviews took place between March and June 2021. This was usually right after colleges opened after lockdown. And we conducted a thematic analysis of the findings, which we'll be discussing mainly with you today.
Sorry, I'm just trying to move the slide on. There we go. So hi, everybody. I'm just going to start presenting some of the findings from our research, just to give you a taster of what we found. So each slide will present some of the quotes from some of our participants. So feel free to read those as I speak through them. But we started off and we thought it's quite a unique characteristic of our findings to start to us interviewees to share with us what their definitions of online learning were. And across the literature, there's many definitions, but a lot of these were defined before COVID. And obviously our experiences have changed a lot since then, and a lot of people have moved to online learning. So we wanted to understand what people's perspectives are now. Now that so many more people have experienced this. And there's a variety of definitions and understandings. Some, for example, some refer to online learning as distance learning, e-learning, hybrid learning, several different definitions, but all with slight variations of what that actually means. We also, within online learning, some of the participants have defined differences between types of online learning, so synchronous, asynchronous, live, not live, and so on. This second quote is quite interesting around a college principal not actually wanting to use the term online learning at all, because they thought that actually excluded some students who didn't have that full access to online learning, so instead preferred the term remote learning.
So the way we organized the themes of this research was by responding to each of the research questions. So under the first research question, the first theme is the mode of delivery, theory versus practice. So what we mean by this theme is most of the participants suggested that online learning they were administering, so if they were tutors, and the online learning that they were receiving, if they were students, mainly focused on theory. So the tutors used the time during lockdown and college closures to complete the theory elements of the course, with the hopes that when the face-to-face courses resume, that the practical elements of the course would also resume. And students expressed that although the learning theory online worked very well, and they were really pleased that their learning could continue during the pandemic, they did feel like they were missing out on the practical element, because often that really needed to take place face-to-face. And in more vocational courses, that practical element is really relied on. So courses such as hairdressing, fashion, and performing arts really relied on that physical environment. And for a majority of the students, this couldn't be replicated online. However, with that said, we did have some participants who were teachers who really did try and be a bit more creative with the way they could deliver their courses online, and they used different digital tools. However, they did say a majority still remained theory-based.
We found also resources and accessibility hugely determined how well online learning works. So most colleges were actually able to deliver laptops to students, Wi-Fi routers, boosters, where staff and students needed it to try and mitigate any loss of learning. So, for example, colleges would assess the needs of individual students, and we kind of found that these small island contexts were a lot more flexible and being able to respond to the needs of individual students and families quickly, in comparison to perhaps, for example, how we experience things in mainland England, and the government's responses was a lot slower in trying to get those digital resources out to individual students. But also there was some issues and barriers to learning because of Wi-Fi connectivity and stability, which were harder to overcome. And many of the students and teachers found that this would disrupt learning at times as well. And then thinking specifically about the fact that a lot of these courses were practical, vocational courses, many of them required a lot of additional resources beyond the kind of digital and online things like laptops, but resources that they would usually have readily available in colleges. So, for example, hairdressing equipment, art tools, for example. So there were issues in getting those out to the students in their homes, and kind of the availability so that they could continue their learning at home as well.
So the third theme here is changes in employer engagement. And as we know, in a lot of vocational courses, employer engagement is a big chunk of the learning. And during college lockdowns, these experiences changed or stopped completely during that time. So college staff really struggled to continue the engagement they had with external partners and employers. And of course, they had to pause that experience. So this was specifically due to the nature of the businesses during COVID-19. And as we know, many industries had their staff working from home, and employers just could not offer that similar setup for student placements. And of course, depending on the nature of the course, there was no contact with employers at all. So hairdressers were completely closed, and it affected courses like public services too, where we saw employers and employees in public services being allocated across the country during the pandemic. So inevitably, those connections just paused. And again, when speaking to the students, although they did say that, they were missing out on this employer engagement, they still really did appreciate that, they could still be able to learn in one way or another online.
Yeah. The other theme we came across was the digital literacy of staff and students. Of course, a lot more online learning and working on computers rather than in person requires a basic level of digital literacy. And there were quite large differences in students and staff readiness for remote learning, and differences amongst, again, students, staff, their proficiency to use online tools. So we found some tutors were identified digital resources that they could apply to their learning, and again, differences between some tutors doing this a lot more than others. And we found that there was potentially a lack of confidence, which held particularly staff back from using more tools beyond their basic functionality as well. Almost all course tutors and students use some form of chat function online to stay connected, and often they'd used these to an extent before COVID, but were using a lot more now that they were learning remotely. And we also found that the student-teacher communication relationship changed quite a bit, and Staff were almost on call 24/7 to respond to students' messages and emails, and so they took on almost a much more pastoral role rather than just a teaching role. And also we found that actually some staff said that a lot of the students' digital literacy was not up to scratch as well, and that even though these students, a lot of them young and all using social media, when it comes to learning, using them as learning tools, and perhaps, for example, building a website, that actually they haven't got the right level of training and standards that they'd like them to have. So some college tutors believe that there needed to be more training for both themselves and for students as well.
Okay, so we're moving on to the findings from the second research question, and the way we organize these findings is in this table. So this is responding to the benefits and the drawbacks of online learning. So we really wanted to try and frame, as you can see, just from first looking at this table, there are a lot more challenges from all the different perspectives of the participants we interviewed. But we tried to say that these are challenges rather than really negative aspects of online learning. I'm just going to pull out one or two to explain, but they are unpacked a lot more in the report. So what we found, which was quite interesting, was a lot of the benefits had some sort of challenge linked to it. So, for example, the flexibility in work hours that staff expressed, they were very happy that they were able to work from home and really build the lesson plans in their own time. And of course, that commutability from home to college wasn't there anymore, so that gave them more time to do things. However, on the back of that, what Kat had just mentioned, they were available almost 24/7 to their students, which made them take on more pastoral roles, and that was a very big challenge for them. That they really appreciated that they were able to get to know the students on a very different level and be available for them at that in that way. However, they did find it very challenging in the long run. Similarly, with students, there was a lot of flexibility to fit learning and independent learning around their personal circumstances, and of course, working at home. However, not all home environments were conducive to learning and working due to some personal circumstances, or not finding a quiet room at home were some examples, and of course, those who had childcare responsibilities. A lot believed that the benefits, and this was a very big benefit from both staff and students, is that their digital skills were improved a lot, and they were really working on their digital skills. So the level that they started off with to the level that they went back to college with had drastically improved, because they were really forced to learn to use a lot of these tools and also learn new tools and bring those in to be more creative with their lessons. So as I've said, a lot of these are going to be unpacked a lot further in the reports.
Okay, and finally, we wanted to understand from the senior staff at the colleges what, due to their experiences of the pandemic and obviously doing lots of online learning, has that influenced their thoughts for the future and what future provision would look like in the colleges. So all the senior staff reflected that they wouldn't want to go back, or they can't now go back to the way things were pre-COVID and just go to full delivery in college only, because of the way that now the world has developed and jobs have moved to this hybrid working pattern, and they thought that they need to keep some aspects of their delivery online. There are differences in kind of different colleges, how much they thought would be online and what elements would be, but they all thought things like a lot more administrative things could be delivered online, and then things like more theoretical aspects of the courses could be as well. They thought it was positive that it allowed staff and students to be a lot more flexible and be able to work at home and learn from home as well was advantageous for some. It also allowed them to think about the physical spaces within the college as well, and what blended learning approaches would mean for the college space, because some might be delivering a course that would be both online and physically in person at the same time as well. So thinking about the spacing as well in the college. So it also finally allowed them to think about how they would react in a crisis again, because a lot of them went into this without having a lot of preparation for what was going to happen. So kind of that emergency response, a lot of them were thinking about as well. Yeah, and as Dana said, a lot more of the findings can be found in our report, which we can post a link for. But thank you for listening, and happy to take any questions.
Kat, Dana, that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I popped the link in the chat as well so people can click through. We've had some really great reflections from colleagues around the world in terms of whether those kind of lessons rang true for their COVID experience as well. So a really interesting point from Rachel, I think in Trinidad, talking about a significant minority of high school teachers not able to teach and their students not able to get online because of kind of digital devices, which I know is something that you found. But let me ask you, first of all, you're both mainland based. What was it like kind of doing this piece of research on small islands, or anything you needed to kind of adapt from previous research techniques that you'd used?
Yeah, it was quite different. Obviously the islands are very different context to what we're used to on mainland colleges. In most of these islands, it was just one college representing the whole island. Most of them didn't have multiple colleges like we do in England. They provide quite an interesting test bed almost, because we kind of thought before that these island contexts have had to, in the past, adapt quite flexibly to different crises and online learning, things like internet provision not being as stable perhaps. So it's quite interesting to see their unique characteristics that are quite different from the mainland. Don't know, Dana, if you want to add anything.
I mean, just one thing to add, I think maybe it's the nature of where we've done our research as well, but speaking to the colleges and the staff members of the colleges, I felt that it was a much more tight-knit community. So, they were really referring to, those across the island, employers across the island, as if they knew them quite well, which is very nice for them to be able to connect with during COVID, right after COVID. So we had one staff member tell us that although there was no employer engagement in a lot of the courses, she had a friend on the island who would be able to kind of deliver some form of employer engagement to her students. So yeah, that's just the feeling that I got during the interviews.
That's great, Dana. Thank you. And just before we move on, I wanted to ask, you pulled out a little bit of this in the presentation as well, but in terms of, you've done some research about the impact of COVID in kind of the UK more generally, and I'll pop a link to that in the chat. But which areas did you see the kind of most difference from the kind of mainland impact and then the kind of particular impact that you were seeing in kind of island colleges? Dana?
I think the difference, I would say, in terms of COVID is the way that the information was being delivered to colleges, or the entire education sector, I guess, on the island. They all, got similar information, were able to share that among each other, whereas some of the research that we did on the mainland was more of a top-down approach.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, some of the islands were linked to Scotland, so were linked to their overall Scottish government policies, but a lot of the other islands were not, were independent from the UK policy, and were able to respond a lot quicker and more flexibly to their own needs, rather than being at the mercy of the government from a big place.
Great. Kat, Dana, thank you so much. What a great start to the session. Really, really appreciate it. If anyone else wants to share any reflections about how COVID impacted on their islands, keep going in the chat, and Dana and Kat will be able to have a look at that whilst the other presentations are going on. But right now, I wanted to welcome another great colleague of ours to the virtual stage. So Lynn Rogers is a researcher in education at University College London, and Lynn has led a piece for Highlands College in Jersey in the Channel Islands. So Lynn, over to you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, everybody. I'm just sharing my screen. I hope that's all okay.
Yeah, we can see that, Lynn.
That's great, thank you. So I know I've got 10 minutes, so I'm going to be trying to be as prompt as I can. I was very lucky during end of 2020 and throughout 2021 to be involved with a project with Highlands College, and that was linked to the Edge Foundation. And it centred very much on Highlands thinking, you know, as a college that has much more independence than colleges in the UK, about how it might think about the curriculum offer for young people, and was it really meeting their needs? And the college itself had done some research and investigation looking into student experiences, and they came to me to ask, would I look at the international evidence base and the literature, and what does that say about some of the themes that they were particularly interested in? And from the start, we all understood and acknowledged that actually at this moment in time, and this was even before the pandemic, there's a real sense of an appetite for change, you know, thinking about, do the sort of strongly exam-based curriculum really afford young people opportunities to demonstrate their creativity and problem solving? How do we place students at the centre of their learning rather than having a very sort of teacher-led approach? And also thinking about different pedagogical approaches that cross subject boundaries, you know, thinking towards a shift to different capabilities and competencies that many people have sort of termed 20th century skills, be that teamwork, reasoning, problem solving, critical thinking, and a whole host of things. And what they'd reflected on as they started this work was that, one, there was a concern that some of the qualifications were outdated, and the young people themselves didn't feel particularly well prepared for their next steps. And they wondered as a college whether they were, you know, preparing students for future careers as best as they could be. And I don't think any of us here need to rehearse or think about the challenges that we face as we move forward, be they to do with climate change, economic challenges, and a whole host of things that beset us at the moment, but a real sense of wanting to think about, could we do something differently? And they also looked at the sort of percentages of time that they were allocating to different parts of the curriculum, and felt that but with some creative thinking, they could free up some space for a more innovative approach. So there were various aspects that they wanted me to look at. One of which was that they wanted tutoring and mentoring to be the glue with this new curriculum offer. And so the first thing I did was look at all the analysis, and there's a summary report and there's a very long report, and I'm sure Ollie will pop all those links in the chat for you. But there's a really strong evidence base about the positive impact of mentoring. And I'm not going to talk through all the bullet points on the slides, but my job wasn't just to inform Highlands about all the positive things. It was also about raising some challenges and issues about the different themes that we were looking at. So if I just pick one example here as an illustration, what the literature shows is that sustained relationships between the mentor and mentee are essential in terms of a positive experience. And there's a suggestion that generally any sort of mentoring relationship should last for a minimum of a year. What we know in practice is this hardly ever happens. So partly I was suggesting what the research tells us about some of the benefits, but also using opportunities to highlight things that they might want to think a little about as they develop their curriculum offer. Another area that was very important to them was thinking about health and well-being, and at no other time has that been so critical, given the experiences of the young people that they've been through during COVID-19, as Dana and Kat have highlighted in their report. And there is this sort of synergistic relationship between health and well-being. You know, if you're doing well at school, that influences your sense of self-esteem. And similarly, actually being healthy and undertaking exercise tends to lead students towards better academic achievements. And certainly there's quite strong evidence that whole school or whole college approaches to social and emotional learning make a difference to young people in terms of thinking about how you might embed elements of this in a formal curriculum, how it impacts on the whole ethos and environment of a college, and also engagement with families and the wider community. They were also very keen to sort of broaden the outlook of the students within the college. So another thing that I looked at was areas to do with enrichment and enterprise, global citizenship, education, and also youth social action. And here, what was evident was that most of the information came from the United States, but again, some very positive ideas about enrichment activities, being associated with higher achievement and aspirations, but also supporting the wider social and emotional and physical development of young people, as well as thinking about employability skills. One of the things that's become more obvious over time, and certainly in England, is the mismatch between the types of skills that young people develop in schools and the skills that employers are wanting in the 21st century. So this embedding of different opportunities for employability skills, incredibly important. One of the real challenges, I think, and this is seen internationally, is how do colleges provide effective careers education, information, advice and guidance for young people? One of the things that research consistently shows is that many young people will have aspirations that remain very narrow, and that these don't necessarily align with the job opportunities that are around, or even thinking about the impact of artificial intelligence. But the literature does suggest that embedded approaches to careers education and guidance are much more impactful, particularly when they're linked with the curriculum. Strong evidence for thinking about the importance of employer engagement, partly so that young people get to understand the world of work. For some people, it's very important to see different role models and to open eyes about different possibilities for the future. Digital is also important there, but I'm going to talk about that in the next slide. Ollie, I can't see the chat, so if you think I'm overrunning, just let me know. And then the other area that we really wanted to look at was future and digital, and partly that was thinking about the digital skills that young people possess. And it's interesting again that Kat and Dana have talked about that in their presentation, and a sense within the college that actually we know that young people need to develop their digital skills. We know that employers are looking for advanced digital literacy, but how do we do this in a meaningful way? And I can remember talking to colleagues at Highlands on one occasion, and they were saying, look, what young people do not want is to sit in a room and be taught how to use Excel. It needs to be much more related to real world learning, different forms of activity. Certainly what we have seen is that although technology has been around for a long time and has offered an enormous amount of potential to transform young people's learning, we don't really have any tremendously successful models on this. Allied to that, what's been quite interesting, and this is relevant when we look at what Highlands has done, is the sort of increase of digital qualifications that are portable, transferable, thinking about micro-credentials and digital badges that are endorsed by members of the local community and colleges and businesses. And the other thing that we looked at as part of this report was thinking about how do organisations sort of plan for the future? How do you look at what type of curriculum offer might be needed for young people, given that change takes quite a long time to do that in terms of designing curriculum, courses and producing assessment models. And there we paid particular attention to Finland in terms of the work that it does. So what's been wonderful, and I mean absolutely wonderful from my perspective, is that the whole literature review and the areas of focus were very much a collaborative and discursive process facilitated by Edge, and certainly Ollie and I worked together from this. But what I've learned most recently is from this September, they've developed a new qualifications framework that they're calling Future Skills. It links very much to the outcomes of the literature review that I undertook for them, and the various modules that they've developed include health and well-being, leadership, sustainability. The whole pedagogic approach is underpinned by a student-led facilitatory way of working, and also they have had various digital credentials designed that will be awarded from City and Guilds. So a really, really exciting opportunity with an island to develop and have much more ownership of a curriculum for young people. What this means, and this relates to the evidence from the literature review as well, that there's a whole institutional embedded approach. There are lots of opportunities for student-led work that cross boundaries. And they're very mindful of the professional development for teachers. So this is something that's been an absolute pleasure for me to be involved in. Happy to take any questions, and I'll stop sharing now.
That's great, Lynn. Thank you so much. So I'm just aware that we've got a really international audience here, and a lot of your work, including this piece, is very international. So I wanted to just ask ask you to start with kind of, I guess, your reflections are on the best ways that different places can learn from each other, and any kind of pitfalls when you're trying to kind of shift a model or shift an approach into a different context.
Gosh, that's two very big questions, Ollie. I mean, one of the things that we know about education is it takes a very long time, to actually get everything together. I think what's been interesting about Highland's approach is they spent quite a long time actually looking and exploring about what was on offer in the college itself. They did some detailed student surveys, and they developed a model. And then, this is my understanding, that then they were doing work with the Edge Foundation. And then as part of that, I came in to actually take an in-depth look at the evidence so that they could get a sense of, well, do these things marry up? So really, we were in some ways trying to join together what I might say the sort of practical ideas that they'd created, and actually provide an evidence base underneath it, which then means it's more robust to be talking about why we're doing this, why it's important, and what are some of the things that we need to look out for. I mean, I think what's so wonderful about a location such as Jersey, which will apply to many of you here, is you have much greater freedom about the curriculum offer that we do in England. And I'm not going to talk about England because I might cry. And I'm really, really interested, though, about the development of this broader, offer that's very student-led, that they've got the digital credentials in place, and be really keen to know how that works. So I think that's the latter part of your question. Can't remember the first part.
Just the importance of looking internationally, which I know is a big theme of your own research.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I remember, in all honesty, with some of the earlier conversations that we had with Jersey, they really didn't want to look at England because they just felt it was too constrained by the system. And you and I both, independently, did a sort of world scan in some ways, and actually came up with several countries that we thought we were worth looking at in more detail. But I think partly from the perspective of Highlands, it was actually, how do we look more broadly? How do we see different sort of systems, different ways of doing things? And particularly because they have the flexibility to then work with that in a way that unfortunately we can't do in England.
Thanks, Lynn. And one final question before we move geographies up to Scotland. Just that theme that came out around broadening the outlook of young people. I just wanted to ask a bit more about that, because I think it's something that will resonate with island colleagues around the world, both this kind of really strong foundation in place and community, but this desire to make sure that young people are kind of citizens of the world as well. Just say a little bit more about kind of that theme and how you took it on.
Yeah, well, I think, I'm sure all of you've looked at the PISA reports that they produce. There was one that they produced last year about young people's career choices, and really they haven't changed in the last 30 years. They're still quite gendered. And they relate to very sort of traditional occupations. So I think there's something that's incredibly important about widening pathways for young people, because they're all going to be working in jobs that you and I don't even know of at the moment, and also are going to have different career pathways, multiple changes. And I think the other thing that was self-evident in the conversations with Highlands that I haven't mentioned was also the importance of enabling young people to become lifelong learners, and also to develop a sense of risk and resilience. So when we thought about digital, most software developers or coders, they learn by making mistakes all the time. So developing this sort of sense of, how do I learn from mistakes? How do I feel confident enough to try things? There are lots of underpinning ideas around that, I think, that are relevant. COVID has impacted on that, and I think made these things incredibly more important. And personally, I think as educators, we have a responsibility to be thinking about how we embed notions of risk and resilience in things that we're doing. But I think also it's about making things meaningful, and that therefore means looking towards the world of work and getting employers involved.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that presentation. And we're going to welcome to the stage now two more colleagues. So we're going to shift the focus slightly to Scotland. So I'm welcoming Jane Atherton, who is Rural Policy Researcher and Analyst at Scotland's Rural College, and Cognac Morrison, who is Islands Recovery Manager and Policy Manager at the Scottish Government Islands team. And they're going to be talking to us about a topic that is at the top of a lot of people's minds at the moment, thinking about child poverty through the lens of rural and island Scotland. Jane, over to you.
Thanks, Ollie. I'm just going to share my screen and hopefully
we can see that, Jane.
Good stuff. Thank you. So thanks, Ollie, and thanks everyone for the opportunity to be here today. A really interesting session so far. And as Ollie mentioned, I guess a slight change of tack in some ways, but it's been really interesting listening to the presentations and thinking about how the work that we've been doing fits with them. So yes, as Ollie says, my name is Jane Atherton. I'm based at SRUC, Scotland's Rural College, just outside Edinburgh in Scotland. And as Ollie said, you're going to also hear from Cognac Morrison from the Scottish Government as part of this presentation, but we'll try and do our best to stick to time. So what we're going to do is focus on some research work that I carried out with a colleague of mine, Jane Glass, over 2021 and 2022, looking at child poverty in rural and island communities. And it was a piece of work for the rural and island policy teams in the Scottish Government. And as I say, I think it's just been really interesting listening to the presentation so far, because I think what we're going to say sets the context in some ways for some of those educational interventions, and the context in the sense of affecting the ways in which children and young people can engage with education, I guess, and with some of those changing practices that Lynn and the other speakers have outlined. So the aim of our work was to contribute to the evidence base for Scotland's National Tackling Child Poverty Plan, which was published earlier this year, and to support colleagues like Cognac in making some recommendations going forwards in relation to islands policy more generally in Scotland. And you can see on the screen there the three questions that we focused on. So we looked firstly at the factors that cause or amplify child poverty in rural and island communities. We looked at the data that exists and doesn't exist to understand child poverty in these areas, but particularly looking at the local scale, and then highlighted some gaps in our understanding and what needs to be done to fill those gaps. Just briefly, in terms of our methodology, it was mainly a desk-based piece of work, although we did do some interviews with stakeholders in Scotland, both at national level, but also at local level. So including talking to some of the representatives of local government or local authorities, and also some third sector organisations like childcare providers in some instances involved in these sorts of issues. So first of all, looking at child poverty and its experience, I suppose, in rural and island context. So the Scottish government recognises 3 main drivers of child poverty, and you can see them there in the diagram on the right-hand side of the slide. So we've got income from employment, costs of living, and income from social security and other kinds of benefits. And I think it's really fair to say that in a rural and particularly in an island context, the way that different issues contribute to those drivers is different, and in ways that are not so common in an urban context. So, for example, we know that many island residents rely on volatile, seasonal, and unpredictable incomes, which affect their overall income, if you like, from work and earnings. We know there can be limited access to training and skills development. We know people rely heavily on private vehicles because of a lack of public transport, lack of local and flexible childcare, and that's an issue I'll come back to. And also in previous research in Scotland, we found a real issue in rural areas and particularly in remote rural and island areas around a very big gender pay gap. The other issue that's been highlighted in several pieces of work in Scotland is the challenge of higher costs of living in rural and island locations. And that can be for a variety of reasons. For example, higher costs of food, a bigger reliance on private transport, which means higher fuel costs, and we all know those have been very high recently. And that's what we mean by that point around additional minimum living costs. Often you can add 15 to 30% to urban costs for those living in some of these more remote and island locations. Fuel poverty is a real problem in many remote rural and island areas in Scotland. Housing is often bigger and older and in poorer condition. So people are having to spend more to keep their houses warm. And I guess that relates to the final point there under costs of living. Housing is a real challenge in many island communities in Scotland. There is a lower level of supply than in urban places. And due to high levels of demand for holiday homes and second homes, there is often, the prices are out of reach of many island residents and it's unaffordable. So that we have that sort of combination of affordability and poor housing condition that is a particular exacerbating factor for child poverty in rural and island locations. And then a final point, which I think is really interesting, there is evidence to suggest that people in island and rural locations are less likely to take up welfare support and benefits that they're entitled to. And that can be due to stigma, the challenge that small communities, people know one another, also a lack of awareness and support available for them to know what benefits they're entitled to, and challenges with the welfare system. For example, it doesn't respond well to people who are in the situation that I mentioned initially with volatile and unpredictable incomes, lots of delivery online, and as Kat and Dana mentioned at the beginning, real challenges in rural and island locations around digital connectivity. So lots of drivers of child poverty that are exacerbated and particularly serious, if you like, in rural and island contexts. I won't go into detail at all on this slide, but basically it shows you the UK parliamentary constituencies in Scotland that have a reasonable proportion of their land that is rural or island. And for example, the second row there, Argyll and Bute, and the fourth row up from the bottom, Orkney and Shetland, show that child poverty, or the number of children in low income households, is growing across these constituencies in Scotland. It is still true to say that from a lower level in many of these island locations, but certainly increasing. And if you look at statistics in Scotland overall, about 1 in 4 children is estimated to live in poverty, and that's been increasing over the last 10 years or so. And worrying times at the moment in terms of how that will pan out over the next 6 months to a year and beyond. So a challenge in island locations, albeit not as bigger numbers, if you like, and that's part of the problem as in urban locations. So what did we learn from our research? Certainly general agreement amongst the people we talked to and the evidence that we looked at, that tackling some of the broader issues that are experienced in island locations will help to alleviate child poverty. So that could be, for example, tackling this real issue around affordable housing, improving public transport, improving education and employment opportunities as well. So thinking about these issues in a real holistic way is really important. We also found that there's some really key gaps in data that can hinder the ability of stakeholders to take effective action. And one of the key things that came out from our research is a real lack of understanding and lack of evidence about people's lived experiences. So whether they are people who are struggling to get public transport, there is a bus, but it's at the wrong time for them to get to work, or there is childcare, but it's not open late enough for them to get from their work or education at one side of the island across to the other side. So we need much better evidence about people's everyday experiences in order to better respond to challenges around child poverty. We need to look at this issue of uptake of welfare support in rural and island locations and understand why people are not taking up welfare support that they're entitled to, and how we can tackle those sorts of challenges and get around those challenges. Cost of living, obviously, is, as Ollie mentioned, is a really key issue, and we need to understand how that's playing out in a rural and island location, and linked to that this issue around fuel poverty. And I think our research highlights some really interesting questions around childcare provision and the ability of that, if you like, to enable people to access education and employment. As I mentioned, is the childcare open long enough to enable people to get from one place to another at the beginning and end of the working day? Is it expensive? Is it flexible? Does it enable an island farmer, for example, to use it at 5 a.m. when he needs to go and milk his dairy cows? Is it flexible enough to allow people to access it at different times of year because of the seasonality of their employment? So lots of real questions about the understanding that sort of local context. And we did find that data is available at local authority level, at our local government level, but often those areas are really large, and particularly when it comes to island and rural communities, those areas are large, and it's really difficult to hone in on those hotspots of deprivation and poverty that exist within those bigger areas. And I think that's a particular challenge for islands that form part of mainland authorities. It can be very hard to disentangle what's happening on one of those islands when it's part administratively, if you like, and from a data perspective, part of a much bigger area. We also found there's no annual systematic review of child poverty statistics in rural and island communities. The rural and island picture, if you like, tends to get lost in national indicators. And I think linked to that, and perhaps because of that, the issues around poverty tend to be seen very much as an urban issue in Scotland, and as I say, the data and the ways of measuring it reinforce that. But in some ways, maybe the next few months represent an opportunity to try and change that narrative and really demonstrate how much this is a challenge in these rural and island places. And the ways in which low income is measured can be really challenging. So often low income is measured without taking into account housing costs. But as I've said, in island and rural locations, those housing costs can be really critical. So we need to make sure that they're taken into account when we're looking at household income levels. And as I said, often the data is only available at too large geographical areas and doesn't allow us to really hone in on those households or even groups of households within rural areas that are struggling with these kind of challenges. And linked to that, as I say, that local level data is really important for targeting action and resources. As I say, in rural and island areas, often children and families experiencing poverty are hidden away amongst much wealthier households, and that makes it much, much harder to identify them from a data perspective and to target them from a policy perspective. So all local authorities in Scotland are now required to publish annual child poverty delivery plans, and they represent a really useful resource going forward that captures best practice, whether that be in terms of data or interventions. And we make a recommendation that these need to be used much more systematically and as a real resource to share knowledge. And as I've said, the importance of this lived experience data, this was mentioned repeatedly in people that we spoke to as part of the project, but also in a conference on child poverty that happened again earlier this year. And this idea of gathering pen portraits, if you like, from people is really important, as I mentioned, around their experiences of transport, around how they experience education provision, how they experience childcare provision. And I think that sort of data needs to be regarded as important as the sort of quantitative statistical data that we all know exists out there, but doesn't necessarily pick up these local level challenges. And one response that we're making to that in SRUC is to set up a rural exchange or a rural and island exchange as a website, a web portal, to undertake large-scale citizen science. And we're going to be launching that in November with a request for people to engage with us from across rural and island Scotland, and indeed beyond, to tell us about how the cost of living crisis is impacting on them. So as I say, a large-scale sort of citizen science approach, and we want to know about people's everyday experiences, whether that's in their household or in their business, about how the costs of food and the costs of fuel and the costs of heating are impacting on their decisions. And as researchers, we will feed that information back to the communities, but also up to policymakers as well. So just finally from me, we, from the research, put forward a series of recommendations for Oecs and his colleagues in Scottish Government, including this really important idea of really recognising and valuing that lived experience data as valid and important. We think networking of key organisations on this theme is really important, and this idea of sharing best practice is vital, and collectively coming up with ways to address these data gaps is really important. I've mentioned the Child Poverty Action reports and using those really strategically. And we made a specific recommendations also to set up a network and a working group of stakeholders to really emphasise the importance of sharing knowledge and best practice between the local leads across Scotland. I think also this recognition of the realities of life on islands is really important, but in particular challenges, but also particular opportunities. We know islands, obviously challenges around distance from the mainland, reliance on ferries, more expensive local food, local shops, transport. These higher everyday costs that families are facing are so vital to fully understand why they're making the kinds of choices that they make. Similarly, in terms of service delivery and service providers like childcare, for example, we need to understand how those costs are impacting on the ways in which they deliver their services. Our sixth point was around, around strengthening cross-issue and cross-sectoral working to take a very much a place-based approach. And I think, just again, going back to the previous presentations, an awareness amongst schools and teachers as to the challenges that particular families might be facing, but which aren't necessarily very obvious, and that will undoubtedly affect their aspirations, their educational attainment, and their general well-being. Better evidence to help schools to support children in different ways in terms of some of these challenges. And then finally, a need to rural and island proof interventions. So this is a checking of policies and legislation to make sure that it's fit for purpose for islands and for all these different challenges that island residents experience. So I will stop there and hand over to Oecs.
Thank you ever so much, Jane, and that was fantastic how you presented there. Hello everyone, I'm Cynioch Morrison from the Scottish Government Islands team, and I'm from the Outer Hebrides in Scotland. I'll start with some brief policy context, which is founded on the Islands Scotland Act, which was enacted in 2018. So the Act required Scottish Government ministers to develop a national islands plan, which we published in 2019. So now each year we report to Parliament through our National Islands Plan annual report, detailing the work that we are taking to improve outcomes for island communities against the commitments that were published previously in our Islands Plan. The Act also introduced requirements for the Scottish Government to, and national bodies also, to conduct island communities impact assessments. So collectively, all of that work underpins our objective of ensuring that there's a sustained focus across government and in the public sector to meet the distinct needs of our island communities and to help them to thrive. Tackling child poverty is a national mission for Scottish Government, and that's really why we commissioned SRUC to undertake this research and to look at child poverty through a rural and island lens. So our team's response to the findings impact across the strategic objectives that are detailed in our Islands Plan. And in order to respond to that, we need to collaborate across government with local authorities, with health boards, local and national stakeholders, and directly in partnership with our island communities. We're already taking action, targeted action, focused on solutions that are rooted in communities. And we're working with Scotland's Improvement Service and in partnership with Public Health Scotland to address important knowledge and data gaps, as Jane referred, particularly in relation to lived experience. And we're also engaging rural and island leads to support localised action. The research also contributed, as Jane referenced, our government's second Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, which is entitled Best Start, Bright Futures. And that sets out the actions that we are taking across Scotland, including the key focus on increasing income from employment, increasing income from social security and benefits in kind, and reducing household costs. So hopefully that very brief snapshot highlights some of the positive work that the research has driven forward. And mindful of the time pressures, I'll stop there. But on behalf of Jane and I, thank you all very much indeed for listening.
Jane, Cognac, what a great presentation. Thank you for doing a good double act. So yeah, I had a couple of areas that I just wanted to drill down onto. Your point, Jane, about kind of data availability rang a really strong bell with some colleagues in the chat. And obviously you were kind of making the point about the islands being part of overall Scotland and then breaking down data, but also there were some challenges that people are raising just about kind of getting a hold of good quality data. So I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on that challenge.
Yeah, I think it's a really important challenge. I mean, clearly there are really important issues around anonymity and confidentiality when we get to really low numbers of people in some locations, whether that's island or rural, and we shouldn't forget that. But it's really hard to see how we can inform policy in a really meaningful way unless we have that kind of data. I'm aware of research that's been done by colleagues in the James Hutton Institute in Scotland, where they looked at population change at local level and found often in many cases positive examples of population growth were masked completely by statistics even at island level. So looking at specific communities within Ireland is really difficult, but it's so important. And I think that's also where the lived experience data comes in, and why we make such a strong plea for it to be regarded as equally as important as that quantitative data, because it can really tell those stories in a way that a number can't. And I think that links to the real diversity of islands everywhere. Scotland has 700 and something islands. I've just done some work in Japan and there's 7,000. So we're talking about large numbers of places where the diversity is just huge. So I think that local level data is so vital to understand those differences.
And if I can just jump in there as well, Ollie. I mean, we're very fortunate to have the islands legislation here in Scotland, and we're very proud of it, to be honest. And the National Islands Plan is terrific, and it's really great that we get the opportunity to report annually to Parliament against that. But aside from the individual commitments within the plan, it's really important for us to see more broadly what the impact is. And that data is really important in terms of how we capture that. So what we actually did last year, just to try and have a slightly different tack, because it's sometimes difficult to affect the levers at a national level to get that data. So what we actually did was we did a letterbox drop. So we sent out a survey to 20,000 households on islands and generated data on the basis of that. So that's a process that we're going to repeat on a cyclical basis. I think it's going to be every 3 years with the same questions, so we can then build up a pattern of the work that we're doing through the plan. Is that impacting on the island in other ways aside from actually the specific commitments that we're saying that we're going to deliver? So yeah, we've tried to think outside the box and find more creative ways when we can't perhaps sometimes, or we can't always affect the broader national data collection processes.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Such an important example. And I think, Jane, you mentioned, or you used the term in your presentation, island proofing, which I love. And obviously we'll have a range of colleagues on the call, both from kind of independent standalone islands, and then from islands, as you just described, where Scotland has a whole range of different islands that it kind of looks after. So I wondered, maybe this one for you, Cognac, to start with, but what's the kind of overall approach to kind of safeguarding and looking after the needs of islands? And I know that's kind of a key role for your team.
So first and foremost, I guess for our team, we're a very, very special team within the Scottish Government. They're all very good, but we're very, very close to our communities. And that stems from the consultation that we did for the plan. We did on-island consultations in addition to the inevitable online consultation. But that was a really important opportunity to bridge a gap directly with communities and make relationships. So although the consultation took place in 2019, we've worked really, really hard to maintain those relationships as time has progressed. So that we've got direct contact, and that was actually unbelievably helpful throughout the pandemic, because we were able to reach out and do temperature checks in island communities to find out how they were getting on, how they were managing, and what support they could do with at times, particularly during the lockdown periods. So that's been incredibly helpful. But most importantly, the island communities impact assessments that we introduced, and they're a duty now for 71 public bodies. That includes Scottish Government, and it also extends to Scottish ministers. So that requires all of those public bodies and Scottish Government to conduct an impact assessment in terms of how that will affect island communities when they're developing or reviewing a policy, a strategy, a service, or a piece of legislation. And if I can be so bold to say this, our colleagues in the rural mainland parts of Scotland are unbelievably jealous, because they can see what a really strong tool that is, and we can actually change policies, legislation right at the beginning, before there's any detrimental impacts from those. Whereas at times there might be an impact for a rural community, and that they don't have that same comeback. So that's a very, very, very strong tool that we have. And if there's anybody in policy elsewhere around the world that would like to learn more, then please do get in touch. But the island communities impact assessments are tremendously helpful for Scottish Government and for our island communities.
Thank you both so much. That's absolutely great. And as you say, Cognac, I think your rural colleagues, but also some of the other islands may be feeling jealous of that process. So that's a very generous offer to share a bit more information about that. Wonderful. Last but not least, I wanted to welcome a colleague who I actually met on our panel at the last Island Summit. So there's clearly something working here. Angel Caglin is Curriculum Specialist at the Department of Education, Innovation and Gender Relations in St. Lucia. Angel, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I am on the other side of the world from most of my colleagues that you've heard from. I am from St. Lucia, a small island in the Caribbean. Fortunately, we are part of the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, so a lot of our work in education happens under their supervision. And I just wanted to talk briefly for the 10 minutes that I have about 3 programs, somewhat connected, that has used research data in St. Lucia. The first that I wanted to talk about was the Oecs USAID Early Learners Program. And this program was a result of research into reading that was done in 6 islands of the Caribbean. I'm looking at teacher and principals' perception of the teaching of reading. I'm engaging in observations of teacher practice in the classroom. I'm analyzing the reading curriculum, and all of that information came together in this intervention, the Early Learners Program, known as the ELP. There were 7 components to this program, including looking at the diagnostic tools used by teachers, using the appropriate intervention for students at risk at the K-3 level, providing resources and materials to those students, using an excellent program of assessment, and training teachers as well through coaching. One of the powerful components that or outcomes from this program that St. Lucia decided to continue sustaining, and many of the other islands as well, was teacher coaching. And this was new to St. Lucia because of our limited personnel in education. So we don't have a lot of teachers who maybe support teachers in the classroom. So we had coaches, teacher coaches. They observed instruction, they provided professional development to teachers, and they spent a lot of time building a coaching relationship with them. And in St. Lucia, that has produced some good results. So previous to the ELP, which was implemented from 2017 until 2020, we did not have teachers engaging in effective diagnostic assessment of students. But since then, through the work that the coaches have done in the educational districts, this year, for instance, every school from grade K to grade 6 conducted diagnostic assessments for all of their students. They then analyzed their data, and they're using that information to plan for instruction at the classroom level, at small groups, group level, and even for individual students. Of course, there's room for a lot of research into what are those coaching models being used by those support persons in the various educational districts, and what effect it's having specifically on teacher practice. Coming out of the Early Learners Program, one of the components, as you can see, the very first one, looked at introducing the appropriate language of instruction to teach reading at the early grades. And one of the deliverables from the ELP was to produce a national language policy, which would look at what are the languages that students are coming into the classroom with. And for St. Lucia, we have a unique situation where we have a French Creole, an English Creole, and the standard version. And so this policy would indicate what languages should be used in the classroom. Traditionally, Creole was not a language that was used in the classroom, but now because we wanted something official, some policy, a draft was developed in 2018. Even after the program ended in 2020, the project part of it ended, St. Lucia continued to work on this policy, and using research that has been done on the Creole language in St. Lucia by persons like Professor Emerita Hazel Simmons McDonald, Dr. Kathy Depradine, and some other colleagues in the diaspora. A small group of language and linguistic professionals got together and prepared an implementation plan, which would really outline what were the various resources and materials and practices and even curricula needed to ensure that students who are coming into the school from the grade K level will be able to have instruction in their first language, in their native language. Since then, we have hosted another conference. That first conference, we brought together colleagues from Haiti, from Martinique, from Jamaica, and of course from St. Lucia to discuss what should go into an effective implementation plan. And then that draft plan was presented to educators and other Creole-related groups in St. Lucia to revise. And a final decision that came out of that was there should be a phase-by-phase implementation of this policy in St. Lucia. Of course, we do require some funding so that can go ahead, but that implementation plan has a very large research component, so that research not only informs the decisions for implementation, but it also continually evaluates the effectiveness of the approaches. So that first phase that we're anticipating would include teacher professional development, so teacher training where necessary, the development and the sourcing of materials for teaching the Creole language, research, as I mentioned, but also piloting this approach or the curricula that would be developed in the early grades to determine their effectiveness. And more recently, because we know that traditionally in St. Lucia, a lot of our initiatives are introduced by the Ministry of Education or by the Oecs, we have a lot of implementation happening in a top-down manner, which has been effective. as you can see from the Early Learners Program and the development of the National Language Policy. However, we also wanted to look at whether innovations or initiatives can be grown at the teacher level. And this brings us to the St. Lucia Education Innovation Lab. This is part of an IDRC funded project. It started in 2021. The aim is to embed teacher-led innovation in the education system so that teachers can become agents of change, shaping the policy that happens at the Ministry of Education level. So as part of this, this project, there are a few levels of research that are happening. So at the teacher level, examining when teachers are given the space to initiate innovations, what are some of the areas that they choose to look at? So with this initiative, teachers are the ones choosing what they would like to focus on, what they would like to explore, and they're being taught a social innovation approach, which focuses on the end users, how they experience a problem, and what kind of solutions would work based on how these end users experience that problem. So the training for teachers is really around that social innovation approach. They're given coaching throughout the process. However, they are the ones selecting what areas they would like to work on, who they would like to speak to, and what direction they would like to take by the end of that innovation process. So the research is looking at what are those areas that teachers focus on, how well they're employing the social innovation approach to education, and as well, how are they prototyping the solutions that they are coming up with. At the principal or the school leadership level, we're looking at the role that school leaders would play in scaling those promising solutions from teachers, from the teacher level, to the school level or even to the district or national level. And at the Ministry of Education administrator level, looking at what are the competencies and mechanisms already in place that can promote the scaling of these innovations and building the capacity of administrators so that they could engage in that scaling. Overall, this initiative would like to determine whether social innovation training will help teachers become comfortable enough to engage in innovation and thus become agents of education reform, whether capacity building for social innovation at the level of administrators will decentralize the process of processes in the education system, how it helps countries like St. Lucia to make progress towards their innovation or education priorities, and how this process of social innovation needs to be adapted for the Caribbean context. And so far, we're engaging in that research. It's still ongoing. What we want to be able to do at the end of this initiative is to see an increased use of social innovation approaches by teachers in the classroom level to solve problems or to seize opportunities that they find in the classroom or at the school level in education. We want to be able to outline a scaling pathway so that those bottom-up teacher-led innovations can be appropriately scaled to the rest of the education system and have an adaptation of that social innovation approach that would be suitable for the Caribbean. So I've been able to share these quick things in 10 minutes. Obviously, if there are any questions or you want any additional information, I think we'll be popping some links in the website and you can always contact me as well. Thank you so much.
Angel, that was absolutely great. Thank you. And it's so nice to finish with a policymaker who is taking research seriously, because that is the dream of all researchers, to have their research kind of impact. So I wanted to just kind of tease out a few a few strands there, I guess. One, I just wanted to ask you really to just reflect on what's most helpful for you as a policymaker when you're kind of commissioning research or when you're reading research. What kind of helps it to have impact in your work?
Well, I think I saw someone in the chat mention the relevance of research to the Caribbean islands. And I think that's one of the main challenges that we have. We do engage in a lot of work here in the Caribbean, but we may not necessarily be recording it. we may not be writing things down so that we can refer to it, we can see how it really applies to the solution setting or the Caribbean setting. So whenever we look at research, even for the early learners program for implementation, best practices were employed, but these were always adapted for the Caribbean context. And there was always a consideration of how does this actually work in practice in the Caribbean, and adjustments were continually made to, take into consideration those necessary adaptations.
It's really helpful, Angel. And one of the things you mentioned was piloting, which obviously is an approach that policymakers take all around the world. But I just wanted to ask, how important is that to your work? Do you think piloting can be an important kind of way of testing something out? And I guess in your particular context, can piloting take place kind of on one island to inform another island in the Eastern Caribbean? Does that kind of sharing of practice happen?
Definitely. For like I said, a lot of our educational work is really spearheaded by the Organization of the Eastern Caribbean, SITCH, which is great because it really allows all of the islands to share their findings, share their approaches, and it enables all of our islands, whether they're teachers, students, to be able to move across the islands easily. What I would say is piloting is one of the ways that we've looked at seeing what adaptations are necessary for our particular context. And it's similar to what the social innovation approach is, which is prototyping, looking at what those possible solutions are, trying them out, getting feedback. That's the whole point, so that before there is a larger scale implementation or scaling, that we have a good idea of what's working, what's not working, what some challenges are or bottlenecks are. So piloting is really important. I see it as a valuable part of research. It's not a part of implementation, but part of research, because there's still a lot of questions that you ask yourself during the piloting to ensure that, yes, everything will go well during scaling or implementation.
Thank you so much, Angel. That's absolutely great. There are a couple of more specific questions about your research in the chat. So while we just finish up, maybe if I could ask you just to answer those in the chat, just so that we can bring the rest of the panelists back. We've covered a huge geographical area and a huge range of themes. So I'm not going to try and summarize absolutely everything, but I wanted to just come back to each of our great guests and just ask for a bit of a reflection on what they've heard, maybe a message that they've heard from another person's presentation that resonated with them, or perhaps a theme that they've seen kind of cross-cutting. So I have warned the panelists, so don't think I'm being too mean to them, that they should have a think about this. So we'll go kind of broadly in the order that we heard people. So perhaps Kat, I could come to you for a little reflection first.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Ollie. And thank you all to the presenters as well, who were really, really fascinating. It's great to hear such variety as well. So yeah, thank you for those. I think one of the things that kind of comes out across many of the contexts and the presentations is the adaptability of the different contexts. So being in these smaller populations, smaller geographical areas, and kind of having a lot more flexibility to deliver the education that they need to, that reflects their local needs as well. So from the presentation we did, and being able to adapt quite quickly and flexibly in response to COVID and lockdowns, to Angel's context as well, and teachers being kind of those agents of change and being able to deliver what they need to in their context as well.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kat. Dana, do you want to reflect next?
Yeah, sure. I think honestly, to add to Kat's, that could also add to transferability across the different contexts in the island. So, what we heard in Scotland about the evaluation tool and how well it's working for them, that could also be transferred into the other contexts of the islands that we've heard. I think reflecting just back to the research that we did, a lot of the colleges were roughly talking about the same thing, but using different words for it. So yeah, just that aspect.
That's really helpful, Dana. And when we have our Island Education Network, which Angel's a member of, and several of the other colleagues around the table, I often find it amazing when people speak from a new island. Everyone else is nodding away, like no matter where they are in the world, they're like, "Yep, same here. That's really resonates with me." And it's nice to see, as you say, that kind of connection between the contexts. I have mentioned this in the chat, but if anyone in the audience is working particularly in further education or skills development in an island context and would be interested in joining that, please just add me on LinkedIn and drop me a message. We're kind of welcoming new members to that. Lynn, perhaps you'd like to reflect next.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's partly about the vibrancy of the work that people are doing in the different areas, you know, all with a really genuine interest in young people. And I also get a sense coming through the chat that there's a lot of interest in connecting up and thinking about how different people sort of do research. So whether there's something that can draw things together a bit more. There seems to be lots of sort of synergy with some of the ideas that we've got here.
That's great. Thank you so much, Lynn. Jane, do you want to go next?
Thanks, Ollie. I guess there's something about listening to local people, or whether they or users isn't the right word, but whether they be, you know, the children, the young people, the students, the teachers, local communities. There's something about putting them, you know, absolute center stage in terms of the research or the sort of policy intervention, whether it's a pilot or an actual intervention, because, you know, only by involving them in that sort of co-design process can we do it right, basically. So I think, yeah, engaging with local people and having them involved from the start in any research process.
Great point. Thank you, Jane. Cognac, over to you.
As you might have guessed, I'm just going to blow our trumpet again and tell you how wonderful we are in the Islands team. So kind of building on what Jane was talking about there, we've actually last month, our Cabinet Secretary was in the Orkney Isles to launch our Young Islanders Network, so that we can bring young people into the heart of our policy development work. So the Young Islanders will actually have a seat in the National Islands Plan Delivery Group, and there will be membership across all of the islands. So for us, it's really important to invest in that right at the heart of policy development. So that's one kind of excellent piece of work that we're really proud of. But I guess for me, my background's in education. So before coming into Scottish Government, I was in education for about 20 years. And I'm just really conscious that on islands, the kind of interconnectedness and cross-cutting nature of everything is just undeniable, and it's really amplified in islands. So that connection between the education and the circular economy and childcare and skills and employment and housing and the path to net zero and transport, and it's just on island, it seems to put a magnifying glass on just how interconnected everything is. And for me, that was very apparent when listening to the speakers today and reading the chat, that we're all in the same boat. We all understand the same and very similar circumstances, even though we're in different parts of the world. So, yeah, I'll stop rambling there, but...
No, beautifully put, thank you. And Angel, you get the difficult job of finalising and finding something new to say.
Well, you're right, because the last panelist, that's exactly my reflection, that there are so many things that so many variables that go into educating our students, that it's important for there to be an intersectoral approach, not just, you know, ministries of education and persons in there working together, but other ministries as well. And while, you know, our Ministry of Education may not be able to commission research, you know, across those areas, it would be really good if those pieces of research are shared, and so that we can form some collaborations. I know in the Caribbean, our biggest challenge is funding a lot of our initiatives. So we would welcome collaborations, and I think that's really important, because I've been looking at the way that so many other discussions around the marine environment and the green economy and all of this can really work itself so well into a learning curriculum for students. But these are some things that we would have to look into, because all of this is really connected. And I really appreciate the presentations today, that even though I'm on the other side of the world, we are similar, we are the same.
Thank you so much. Beautiful place to finish, Angel. I just want to say a huge thank you to our panelists, huge thank you to our audience here and on Twitter and on LinkedIn. So yeah, it's great to have everyone with us. And I just want to hand back to Audrey just to close the session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ollie, all the speakers. This was a very amazing session. Again, thank you, the Ed Foundation, for for being with us for the past 3 years. You have, and that's for all the person in the audience, 4 more sessions today, including a networking session. And the next one is in conversation with Caroline Mayfood, CEO of the Grace Foundation, Grace Kennedy Foundation. It's an hour. It's in 30 minutes, actually, at 1 p.m. New York time, 6 p.m. London. And thank you, everyone, for joining. And thank you, the Edge Foundation, for being here today. Thank you.